U.S. Border Patrol has violated a federal judge's order to stop deporting unaccompanied minors without granting them asylum interviews. At least 66 children have been expelled from the country using a pandemic emergency border policy that a judge overruled in November. At least one of those children is a U.S. citizen. Most of the minors were between the ages of 12 and 17, and the Justice Department is now moving to have the judge's orders suspended for a second time. So let us bring in CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez to talk more about this. Camilo, our focus has been on the election and on the pandemic, and a lot of people have stopped focusing on what's happening at the border. So it's very good to have you here. Remind us what the judge originally ruled back in November and what federal laws the Trump administration is breaking that protects migrant children.
Yes, good morning, Anne-Marie. In November, U.S. District Court Judge Emmett Sullivan ruled that the public health law the Trump administration has been invoking since March does not actually allow border officials to expel migrants, including unaccompanied children, without a court hearing or without the opportunity to request asylum or other forms of relief from deportation. The judge also said that the Public Health Authority, which dates back to the late 19th century, does not supersede several legal safeguards Congress created for unaccompanied migrant children. Under U.S. law, Anne-Marie, unaccompanied migrant children are supposed to be quickly transferred to the U.S. Refugee Agency, which oversees a network of shelters and other housing facilities where these migrant minors can stay while they await to be released to sponsors who are typically family members in the U.S. They can request asylum or special visas for minors who were abused, neglected, or abandoned, and other forms of relief from deportation while they await their court hearings. But under this policy, the administration expelled thousands of unaccompanied migrant minors without allowing them to request any type of humanitarian refuge. And as we know, Anne-Marie, some of these minors come here because they flee certain violence in their home countries, domestic abuse, gang threats, and the like.
And you actually spoke to several shelter officials about housing unaccompanied minors during a pandemic. Of course, the concern was that people would be coming over the border unchecked and they would be contributing to the pandemic. They would be bringing COVID over. The people you spoke to believe that they can get protections for these children while also following COVID protocols. What were their suggestions to you?
Yes, so the Trump administration's main argument is that we are in a public health crisis on a global scale that requires strict border controls, and that allowing migrants to undergo their immigration proceedings here in the U.S. will overwhelm migrant holding cells, shelters for minors, and that the coronavirus will spread as a result of allowing migrants to have an immigration court hearing here in the U.S. But advocates, of course, say that even during a public health emergency, you can still uphold our U.S. And international obligations to asylum seekers. And so these shelter providers who work with the government, they house migrant minors under contracts with the U.S. Refugee Agency. They told me that they still have space to house children from Central America and other parts of the world, and that there are safe ways to house them even during a pandemic. They told me the U.S. Refugee Agency could move quicker to discharge minors to their sponsors, who, as we said, are typically family members in the U.S., and that they can open up more shelters, emergency shelters, while they expect the crossings to increase in the winter and the spring of next year.
So then the number of beds available to unaccompanied minors, have they been reduced because of the pandemic? Because, in sort of when we talk about homeless shelters and stuff like that, there needs to be more space. People need to be more spread out. But the people you spoke to said, there's ways to work around all of that?
Sure. Yes, that's a great question, because the U.S. government has more than 13,000 beds designed to house unaccompanied migrant children who are apprehended along U.S. borders. But that capacity has been reduced to less than 9,000, according to the Refugee Agency, because of COVID mitigation policies. There needs to be more room to space out the minors when they are housed. But there's still only so far about 3,500 unaccompanied migrant children in U.S. custody right now. So there is some bed space available. But what the administration is arguing that as border crossings by minors increase and that they expect a surge in the coming weeks, that capacity is going to be overwhelmed, and that's going to be a conducive environment for the spread of the coronavirus. But again, advocates and shelter officials told me that many of these minors, even when they test positive for COVID, tend to recover quickly, just like other young people in our domestic population, Anne-Marie, and that none of them have required hospitalization as of yet. The refugee agency actually conceded that to me last week. None of these minors have been hospitalized after testing positive for COVID. So all these shelter officials believe that there's still a safe way to house these minors.
That's all good news. Listen, before we let you go, I got to ask you about something else. There are reports of another caravan heading this way, coming from Honduras, and that the expectation or the desire of this caravan is to get to the U.S. by the time the Biden administration takes over. Are there concerns that we will see sort of an uptick in these sorts of caravans heading to the border with the new administration?
Well, the Trump administration certainly thinks so. It has said in federal court that a combination of factors, recent hurricanes in Central America, the ongoing political and economic instability in the region, President Trump's electoral loss in the election, and this ruling by the judge in D.C. that prohibits the administration from expelling migrant minors will be conducive to a surge at the border, and that more people are going to come here because they're going to think that the U.S. has more welcoming policies when it comes to migrants and asylum seekers. So I think this will definitely be a test for the incoming Biden administration, which, as you know, has pledged to undo many of Mr. Trump's more restrictive asylum and border policies. So I think they're going to have to walk a very fine line in terms of how fast they undo some of these policies and how they move forward to surge resources at the border when we expect border crossings to increase, especially for minors. Because as we saw last year when there was a surge, Armory, we saw horrible conditions for migrant minors in U.S. custody, and several kids died.
Yes, indeed, Camilo. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.